Hello, everybody. A very warm welcome to day 2 of Partition Machine. And we are starting strong with our keynote from Professor Laura Robson, who is an Oliver McCartney Professor of History at Penn State University. She is a scholar of international and Middle Eastern history with a focus on refugeedom, forced migration, and statelessness. She's the author of several books, including one coming out this year. It's called Human Capital, A History of Putting Refugees to Work, coming out in November 2023 by Verso. Other than that, she is very well published, as we all know. So she's the author of several books, including Politics of Mass Violence in the Middle East, 2020, Oxford, States of Separation, Transfer, Partition, and Making of the Modern Middle East, UC 2017, and co-editor of Partitions, A Transnational History of 20th Century Territorial Separatism with Ari Dubnov, Stanford 2019, and that blew my mind, that edited volume. So thank you so much, Laura. It's an honor to have you. The floor is yours. Please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you so much, Dave, for that kind introduction, and also for organizing this wonderful workshop. I've already learned so much from all of you, and I'm really thrilled to be here, and also to see partition kind of take its place as a genuinely global topic that we can think about from so many different directions. So thanks so much for doing this. So I'm going to talk about some things that haven't come up very much yet in this workshop. And I think it fits well with what Glenda said yesterday. She pushed us to think further back. I'm going to push us to think further forward, right? So that we can think about the kind of longue durée of the concept and practice of partition. And I'm going to do so through talking mostly about Palestine, which is something that has come up, but not in great detail so far. And I want to begin by observing that there's actually, I think, considerable irony in the fact that partition as an idea has become so closely associated with Palestine, when in fact what actually happened there in 1948 bore vanishingly little resemblance to what we think of as partition's main goal of producing ethnically distinct and segregated sovereign states, right? So it's indisputable that, you know, the way that partition was discussed and imagined for Palestine over quite a long period of time is indisputable, right? We know this, we've got records of this, we think about it a lot. And those conversations were obviously crucial for the development and emergence of the concept of partition and its purposes. But there are other times and places, and I would say that the Greek-Turkish quote unquote exchange that was dictated by the Treaty of Lausanne is among them, where the concept of ethnic partition, as we usually understand it, was more fully executed, right? And yet that are less closely associated with partition as an idea. So I'm posing the question to start, why is Palestine continually understood as a kind of ground zero for partition when it was never actually accomplished there? So I want to suggest that Palestine is central to this conversation for two related reasons. One, which I'm referring to in my title for this talk, is that it was continually a kind of space of experiment for imperial and then for international strategy from the 19th century up to the present day, a kind of laboratory for political practice in the service of empire, if we will. So in that respect, what was imagined and proposed and discussed for Palestine was never just intended for use there. It had a wider audience and a wider influence than we might expect from such a small kind of corner of the British Empire, right? And the idea of partition obviously had plenty of pre-Palestine manifestations, as lots of people, including those in this room, have pointed out. And for our purposes in particular, the Treaty of Lausanne and the Greek-Turkish exchange was crucial, I think, for its experimental validation. Working? Oh, there we go. Okay, sorry. For its experimental validation of ethnic cleansing as a mode of modern state building. So that's also a laboratory of sorts, right, in some respects. But as it played out in Palestine, the conversation around partition assumed a kind of imperial capacity to act in a different way and a kind of experimental tone around making such decisions, right? So what I mean by this is that rather than responding to an exodus that had already begun, as happened in wartime Anatolia, here the conversation from the 1930s onward was about imperial enforcement from above. A theory turned practice rather than a practice turned theory, and one that could potentially be expanded to other spaces. I'll just note, kind of as an aside, that this is also true for other iterations of imperial practice in Palestine, the concept of a third-party settler presence, for instance, as a kind of imperial assist, some of the novel mechanisms of imperial security and policing, and, to some degree, the concept of the internationally sponsored mandate itself, and I could go on. So in other words, there are modes of political control that were developed for Palestine with an eye to their possible use elsewhere. And partition, I think, is one such idea, a concept that might work in Palestine itself and could be honed there for possible deployment elsewhere if things went well, or maybe even if they didn't. So that's one kind of possible explanation for the importance of Palestine to discussions of partition, both then and now. And then, maybe more centrally, we have the specific historical trajectory of partition there. What actually happened in Palestine in 1948? Obviously, in the sense that no Palestinian Arab state emerged, we can't really say that partition was accomplished. And instead, what happened was that Palestinians came to occupy a different political and actually territorial space, and that is the space of the refugee. They were segregated into specific areas, placed under international authority, and maintained there as a kind of political reality in the absence of a state and the rights that might have come along with it. What I want to suggest here is that what we have in this post-1948 moment is not a failure or an abandonment of partition, but a refinement of it, a new iteration of it, right? And that part of the reason that Palestine remains so closely associated with the concept of partition, despite the specifics of the outcomes there, is that it was the space where partition's next iteration was developed for broader use. In Palestine after 1948, partition moved beyond its original goal of moderating the chaos of decolonization and opening a path for continued imperial intervention. And it became something different and arguably something more. And that is a strategy for the long-term containment of the post-colonial displaced. Palestine, in other words, saw the enforcement of a different but still recognizable imaginary of partition, one that achieved the goals of separation, segregation, and external control without bestowing actual nation-state status on the participants in this grand experiment. And it was an idea that would indeed cast a long shadow over the rest of the 20th century and now into the 21st, as the long-term confinement of refugee populations became one of the loci of international policy and practice surrounding mass displacement. Okay, so let me begin by trying to trace out the process of how Palestine provided a laboratory for moving partition from a state-oriented, quote-unquote, solution to the problems of decolonization towards an international refugee practice directed towards those same goals. In the first instance, I think we should note that even the initial imaginaries for partition in Palestine were never as clearly oriented towards the emergence of independent sovereign states as we often imagine. And actually, even quite early visions for partition there imagined some kind of liminal political status for at least some of the affected populations. And they made international oversight of these cases a central piece of their conception. So in other words, I think we need to begin by acknowledging that even fairly early iterations of partition for Palestine had considerable room for non-state oriented outcomes. Thank you. So let's take a look at some of the specifics. We talked about this a little bit yesterday, but when partition was first formally proposed for Palestine in 1937, in the report of the so-called Peel Commission sent by the British government, its main author drew explicitly on the Irish and Greek Turkish cases as justification for their new proposal for Palestine. But the particulars of this proposal imagined partition into separate Arab and Jewish territories, not really, as is often suggested, into two independent states, but rather one Jewish state and one Arab territory to be attached in some vague way to Jordan via the mechanism of mass forcible transfer. And you can see the precise, or really the kind of deliberately, carefully imprecise language that was used here: an Arab state consisting of Transjordan united with part of Palestine. Not to mention, of course, the concept of the so-called international zone that also made up a part of this proposal. So, in other words, even in the late 1930s, the idea of maintaining Palestinians in some kind of long-term suspension of national political status and possibly under some form of international authority was already a crucial part of the political imaginary of partition. Okay. And then when the United Nations put together its own commission to determine the future of Palestine in May of 1947, this manifestation, which was imagined as producing not so much a sovereign nation state as some kind of vaguely defined collective under international supervision, emerged even more strongly. The conclusion that was agreed on by the majority of the United Nations Special Commission on Palestine, UNSCOP, advocated strongly for partition, although we should note that there were significant and vocal dissenters. But in its details, the committee put forward a plan clearly inspired by the 1937 Peel Commission that divided Palestine into three parts: an Arab state, still extremely vague in its details, to comprise 43% of the mandate territories, a Jewish state encompassing 56% of the territory, and including the northern coast, the eastern Galilee, and most of the Negev, and of course, a quote unquote corpus separatum, including Jerusalem and its surrounds, which would be subject to some form of international rule. So obviously, just like the Peel Commission's plan, this division of territory suffered from what we might call a major demographic issue. And one of UNSCOP's own subcommittees produced a minority report that predicted that, quote, at the outset, the Arabs will have a majority in the proposed Jewish state. Notably, though, the kind of mandatory forcible transfer that the Peel Commission had felt more or less comfortable recommending in the late 1930s had lost its appeal in the aftermath of a world war that was characterized by displacement of the most dramatic kind, despite the more or less simultaneous Allied willingness to use it in Soviet-occupied zones. So this commission, unlike its British counterpart a decade earlier, stopped short of recommending forcible removal. And instead, the newly constituted UN would be charged with actively managing the populations who were falling into some kind of liminal political status as a consequence of this particular experiment in demographic engineering. So already here too, in 1937, again in 1947, the way that partition was imagined for Palestine was not as a blueprint for clearly segregated, ethnically specific sovereign states, but rather it manifested as a kind of long-term holding pattern, vague in many of its details, intended to suspend conflict rather than to solve it. The other thing that I think we need to note here is that this suspension was carefully designed to create a sphere for the operation of a new kind of international imperialism. In the committee's vision, the UN would take on much of the political authority of its League precursor. The partition proposal assigned the UN a special responsibility to ensure what it called minority rights, in the language of the League, quote, including the protection of the linguistic, religious, and ethnic rights of the people, which further referenced, a long established colonial trope that this was somehow especially true for Palestine, quote, in view of the fact that these two people live physically and spiritually apart, nurture separate aspirations and ideals, and have widely divergent cultural traditions. It carried on the League's claim that such ethno-national conflicts indicated its successor's right and indeed its responsibility to intervene to protect what it called peaceful relations in the Middle East. And you can see the sort of linguistic emphasis on this international role here, right? Taking into account the charged atmosphere in which the Palestine solution must be effected, it is considered advisable to emphasize the international obligations with regard to peaceful relations, which an independent Palestine would necessarily assume. And we should say that this kind of vague but suggestive insistence recurs in a number of other places in the UNSCOP report and in the discussions surrounding it. So in other words, the new United Nations, far from representing a kind of new voice for internationalism, was taking up not only the League's now decades-old legitimization of the principle of ethno-national separation that manifested in partition, but probably more importantly, was also claiming the right to administer and manage and maintain such distinctions and relationships. So, as the UNSCOP report put it in another moment, quote, regardless of the historic origins of the conflict, the rights and wrongs of the promises and counter-promises and the international intervention incident to the mandate, there are now in Palestine some 650,000 Jews and 1,200,000 Arabs who are dissimilar in their ways of living and for the time being separated by political interests. Only by means of partition can these conflicting national aspirations find substantial expression and qualify both peoples to take their places as independent nations in the international community and in the United Nations. Okay, so this particular decision, or proposal, we should say really, to partition Palestine was taken not only on the basis of the committee's consideration of local conditions, but in view of a more general consensus on the part of the leading members of the General Assembly, and maybe especially the new permanent members of the Security Council, that the UN had a muscular and indeed a decisive role to play in the remaking of the global order. And in fact, this new iteration of partition imagined a UN that would justify its own existence, not just as a collaborative of successful ethnic nationalisms, but as an external maintainer of such claims. And indeed, of these populations who are being kept alive, however minimally, in post-colonial exile. The mechanisms for the eventual emergence of these post-colonial nations remained conveniently undefined in this moment. And in the event, the practical way that partition would end up offering the opportunity for the UN to intervene aggressively in Palestine would actually be by serving as a self-proclaimed custodian of the hundreds of thousands of refugees created by the partition decision and the war. Okay, so now let's take a look at that next step in this transformation of the idea of partition away from the nation state and towards the refugee. In late 1949, the UN established a new agency that it called the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees, colloquially known as UNRWA, to assist Palestinians with the practicalities of their displacement. This organization essentially marked the abandonment of the political project of some sort of actual settlement of the Palestinian-Israeli issue in favor of long-term basic material relief for the displaced. It was explicitly forbidden from engaging in mediation of any kind or political advocacy. It had a parallel organization that was designated for that purpose, which was essentially dead in the water by 1951. And instead, what UNRWA did was to provide for refugees maintenance in a series of territorially segregated, internationally administered geographical spaces, negotiated with a variety of neighboring host states over at least a medium and possibly a long term. Sounds familiar, right? Despite its theoretically temporary status, it's one of the great ironies of the Palestine situation that UNRWA remains theoretically a temporary agency whose mandate has to be re-upped in the General Assembly every 3 years. Despite this, it was almost immediately recognized as among the most consequential of the early United Nations agencies and was serving nearly 1 million people by 1951. So the international confinement and maintenance of Palestinian refugees was already coming to serve as a placeholder, a replacement, a new iteration of an earlier, marginally more state-based conception of partition. And there was more. This kind of partition-derived refugeedom, which the international community had an interest in maintaining in order to secure some degree of political control over an increasingly volatile decolonization, had immediately to be clearly segregated legally and politically and intellectually from a different iteration of the post-war refugee regime, a non-partition related variety through which European refugees were being resettled via the UN and its attending agencies. Thanks. The Refugee Convention of 1951, which was arrived at after the discussions had begun surrounding the construction of the so-called Palestine refugee, defined a normative refugee specifically in terms of the Second World War as someone who had had to leave his place of residence as a result of, quote, events occurring in Europe before 1st of January 1951, which was one option, or events occurring in Europe or elsewhere before 1st of January 1951, second option, and now could not return, quote, owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted. So this was a definition whose application to refugees from some now disbanded or ethnically reconstituted former colony was deliberately unclear, right? These are sort of a vague relationship. And that is a circumstance that Palestinian refugees shared with any number of other non-European displaced populations, not least the millions of people who were displaced almost simultaneously in the Indian Partition in the summer of 1947, and who were totally ignored and exempted from this new refugee regime. But this uncertainty wasn't enough. And now we have an even more concrete basis for decolonial exclusion from this definition of the refugee put into place. And that was the declaration that no one could claim the protections of the new United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, who was receiving aid from another UN organization. In practice, the stricture initially applied more or less exclusively to Palestinians, for whom the prior existence of UNRWA rendered aid from the UNHCR or legal protection under the convention both impossible. And as we'll see, in the longer run, changes within the UNHCR would allow for this formal definition not to apply to decolonial refugees, even if they were receiving services from the UNHCR. So, in other words, there were now officially two refugee regimes that had very little to do with one another. One was a reimagining of interwar European migration policy that was aimed at making some kind of resettlement possible for European victims of first the Nazis and later the Soviets. And the other was a reimagining of colonial partition schemes aimed at the perpetuation of decolonial refugee confinement and beginning, but maybe not ending, with Palestine. In keeping with these priorities, which were established very quickly, right, in the first years after 1949, after the Refugee Convention in 1951, across the following decade, UNRWA as an institution made it more and more explicit that its main task was to limit regional political disruption by restricting Palestinians to carefully delimited and controlled geographical areas. The makeshift tent villages that were established during and after the 1948 war were made into more or less permanent settlements, the main goal of which was to close down refugee attempts to move around in search of their homes, property, or relatives. In Jordan, the Hashemite monarchy instituted a punishment of 6 months imprisonment for this offense. In Lebanon, refugees were subject to fines and imprisonment for trying to move around the country, even from camp to camp, and endured all sorts of immobilizing regimes, including curfews and active police repression. In Gaza, as the Egyptian government established military rule, it refused to allow refugees to travel into Egypt proper. An Arab League resolution in 1954 that called on Arab host states to offer travel papers to Palestinians in the Middle East and further afield was allowed to lapse quietly. It was apparently in no one's interest to allow Palestinian refugees even a modicum of freedom of movement or unmediated access to a regional job market, and instead, both regional nation-state authorities and the international community in the form of the UN agreed that the Palestinian refugee had, above all, to be contained, both politically and physically. So this, in the event, was what partition looked like for Palestine. Not an independent Palestinian state, but the long-term maintenance of national refugees in confinement and isolation. This is something that would become even more intensive following the 1967 war and a further mass displacement into states that were feeling more fragile than ever. Under these orders, UNRWA was soon self-reporting that its central purpose was, quote, the preservation of the cultural identity of a displaced and dispersed people. A new vision of partition, indeed. So basically, in other words, UNRWA as an institution in its first 10 years committed to helping to maintain some form of Palestinian national identity in return for enforcing an indefinite confinement and exile. UNRWA's own representatives put it this way, quote, there would appear to be little doubt that the services which UNRWA has rendered with the cooperation and assistance of the host governments have contributed to maintaining the precarious stability of the area and perhaps to the creation of a climate which may enable the forces which are shaping the future of the Middle East to work in a more orderly evolutionary manner. We should also note in this connection that the active containment of Palestinian refugees was an increasingly crucial element of a rapidly developing American economic and political relationship with post-colonial governments across the Middle East. By 1961, the US State Department was explaining its financial backing for UNRWA, which was substantial. It probably funded something like 70% of the agency for the first couple of decades, by pointing out that at a cost of 9 cents a day, the organization had been what it called, quote, remarkably successful in keeping the potentially explosive refugee problem under control across the region. The American head of UNRWA, John Davis, perhaps put it even more clearly when he said, quote, UNRWA was one of the prices and perhaps the cheapest that the international community was paying for not having been able to solve with equity the political problems of the refugees, and adding, quote, it was surely well worth the cost. So the initial iteration of an imagined partition that would result in a Palestinian nation state of some kind had proved costly, difficult, maybe impossible to accomplish. This version of partition was cheap and easy by comparison, and it accomplished most of the same goals, at least in the short term. Okay, so the international community is declaring this privately, at least, to be a success. And now with Palestine as a kind of laboratory and model, we can observe a turn towards a more general practice of precisely the same kind of long-term refugee containment directed and maintained by the international community in other places. A generally applicable partition-derived solution to the wide variety of instabilities related to decolonization. In the first instance, the practice of long-term refugee internment in the decolonizing world moved from Palestine to Algeria, which not incidentally was also a place where an earlier concept of partition had been discussed as a possible decolonial outcome. I think it's probably worth outlining this story very briefly, as I don't think it's well known even among scholars of partition, that a number of admittedly contradictory and uncertain plans for the partition of Algeria emerged in the late 1950s prior to the final dissolution of French colonial rule in 1962. And I want to note that historian Arthur Osseroff has outlined these discussions to very striking effect if you're interested in reading more about them. These proposals coincided in the first instance with a French effort to create a separate colonial administration for the Sahara, a precautionary move to protect French access to oil fields and maintain control over French nuclear testing grounds. So after a series of unsuccessful attempts in the mid-1950s to create some kind of French-run quote-unquote national territory there, in 1957, there was established a new common organization of Saharan regions for the stated purpose of, quote, the development, economic expansion, and social promotion of the Saharan regions of the French Republic, which involved creating a new ministry and handing over control of that territory to Paris from Algiers. And then in 1960, we have a remarkable meeting where Ben Gurion met with de Gaulle in Paris to suggest the creation of a French zone connecting the Mediterranean with the Sahara, thus preserving both the European heavy urban centers of the coastal north and French control over Saharan oil resources. You can see from this map, this is not a terribly well-articulated or imagined plan. And de Gaulle himself seems to have regarded partition mostly as a strategic threat to intimidate the FLN. But his prime minister and also his future minister of information, who wrote this book, developed a substantial enthusiasm for the idea, articulated it in a series of articles in Le Monde, and published it as a book. And so soon the new prominence of the partition idea, despite its kind of, implausibility, let's just say, was causing alarm within the FLN, which pressed the UN to state its commitment to what it called the territorial integrity of Algeria and held a series of anti-partition demonstrations that were unsurprisingly put down brutally by the French military in the summer of 1961. This book on partition appeared in the same month, and it made reference to the British approaches to partition in India and Cyprus, as well as Palestine, while also protesting that this iteration would represent a specifically French form of non-racial partition, right? It is not about separating two races, but two varieties of Algerians, those who wish to live with France and those who wish to live without and against her. So to make a long story short, these conversations about partition represented one of the notable backdrops to the unfolding of the UN campaign in the late 1950s and early 1960s to assist Algerian refugees fleeing into Tunisia and Morocco. This project began in 1957 and continued for the remainder of the war. Part of the goal of this intervention was a clear UNHCR determination to keep or even to make Algerians Algerian, particularly as the war's refugees were increasingly constituting a serious challenge to the emergence of clear post-colonial borders and unambiguous post-colonial nationality. The refugees included all sorts of people whose liminal national or citizenship status posed, a problem of some kind for any future iteration of regional states, partitioned or otherwise. So FLN soldiers inside and outside Algeria, nomads who were accustomed to crossing between the Algerian-Tunisian borders multiple times every year, labor migrants who moved between national spaces with ease prior to the war. So here, as in Palestine, refugee policy took inspiration from partition's underlying principle of national segregation. The UNHCR corralled refugees into delimited, defined physical spaces, as you can see in these photos, and ensured that the refugees could be collected, tracked, nationalized, and prevented from absorption into the host country. In the case of Algeria, this tactic of delineating specific border areas to hold refugees in segregation from their host populations would also make it possible to shore up the eventual post-colonial state by doing what they called returning or repatriating large numbers of people, some of whom were newly designated as Algerian, to the post-colonial state in the aftermath of the war, in a mass resettlement that might well remind some of us here of the nature and particularities of other earlier partition schemes. So Algeria became the next sort of experiment in seeing how a partition-conscious concept of national containment, confinement, and return for refugees might work somewhere other than Palestine. And it was broadly deemed to be a success. Over the next decade or two, following on the UNHCR's Algerian adventures, and of course with UNRWA still operating in exactly the same way in Palestine, the UN gradually committed itself to a wide-ranging refugee regime that owed considerable inspiration to this new iteration of partition as refugee maintenance. The agency involved itself in many, maybe even in most of the mass exoduses of the 1960s that took place throughout Africa. It operated amongst Angolan refugees in the Congo, Ghanaians in Togo, Rwandans in Uganda, Burundi, and Tanganyika, to name just a few. And following on the approach taken to Algerians in Tunisia and Morocco, and to Palestinians before that, these campaigns all came to emphasize medium to long-term encampment and internment in segregated, and maybe we should say partitioned, internationally run zones. Just as had been done for Palestine, these sorts of projects of maintenance in exile were carefully distinguished from the parallel but distinctly separate refugee regime that was intended to create paths for European resettlements, and which was now in the main being applied mostly to Soviet dissidents coming into the West. The UNHCR's official chronicler put it this way, saying that the organization, quote, was compelled to create responses different from its work in Europe. And the new UNHCR's High Commissioner, Felix Schneider, created what he called a category of the new refugee to describe who should be contained in place, maybe detained is a better word, as the UN's primary response to decolonial displacement. So in these and many subsequent iterations, the UNHCR understood its requirement, its job in decolonizing territory to be one of segregation and maintenance, keeping its refugees in what we might well call partitioned spaces, distinct from their host states, run by international agencies, and occupying a deliberately undefined political space vis-a-vis the crucial questions of citizenship, territoriality, and national sovereignty. These were deliberately liminal spaces that could be quickly shut down if, as in Algeria, the imperatives of some kind of internationally sanctioned state construction required it. Or they could be extended as long as necessary. In cases like Palestine, maybe more or less forever. And one of the upsides of this new refugee-oriented partition was this near total flexibility. Okay, so let me just briefly wrap up my comments here by saying that, of course, the Palestine partition can be traced out in lots and lots of other ways as well. There are plenty of other long shadows that I haven't mentioned, endless and endlessly unfolding consequences, local and regional and global, of these original proposals for partition in Palestine, and of course, of the 1948 war and its outcomes. And I don't want to suggest that this is the only one. But I do want to suggest that there is this one legacy of partition, and particularly of its specifically Palestinian trajectory, that we as historians have insufficiently recognized. And that is that it was in Palestine that the imperial concept of partition morphed into a racialized refugee regime run by a newly rebranded international community in the form of the United Nations that committed itself more and more and more strongly over the subsequent decades to the principles of refugee immobilization, containment, and control. And eventually, this was a system that operated almost exclusively in formerly colonized regions to immobilize nationally defined refugees over long periods of time. It was a strategy that was designed to produce a kind of flexible but potentially semi-permanent freeze on the political resolution of various conflicts and migrations. So in other words, to return to the question I posed to you at the beginning, I think it's possible that part of the reason we continue to associate Palestine with the concept of partition is that it provided a kind of ground zero for a still extant version of the idea, one that abandoned the goal of quote unquote solving the problems of decolonization in favor of merely indefinitely suspending them. Thank you very much.
We have 15 minutes for questions.
Great, so we have questions. So what happens about all?
We could talk about this too if you like. I'm happy to do that.
Thanks, Laura. This was really rich. Trying to make sense of those today. Good here. I'm kind of interested in hearing more on the time work that you're doing here. Listening to you talk about these kind of temporary permanence, right? These long-term suspensions. I'm reminded of the 19th century onward, Empire, certain language of constant control, right? Where
Yeah.
the idea that
Yes.
colonialism will end,
Yeah,
but
just not yet.
like, we're not quite sure when.
Right.
And so I'm interested, like, creation of the refugee camp, as a supposedly temporary space. I mean, are there kind of like similar sort of benchmarks for release, right? Is the camp a rehabilitative space or potentially rehabilitative space? What is the kind of, I understand that they become these kind of, there's an endless sense to them, but
Yeah.
Are in these imaginations of those who kind of create them, where does that go? And one other sort of follow-up is you talked briefly there about the emergency care and development
Yeah.
and its during this period, and I guess I would like to hear a little bit more about that, because this is emerging as the United States is kind of pivoting in its imperial identity after the Second World War.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, I think they're related actually in some respects, right? So the interesting things, I absolutely agree with your premise that this is a strategy, a kind of rhetorical strategy that is connected to other rhetorical strategies of decolonization and of kind of the, ongoing postponement, and not just of formal independence, but of the kind of terms of sovereignty, right? I think that those are related conversations for sure. But one of the interesting things about the refugee regime is that, so I'll take UNRWA as my example here, but this could be applied to other iterations of refugee maintenance as well elsewhere. We have a language of temporariness that is belied by the kinds of institutions that are being put into place almost immediately, right? And so when you think about UNRWA, I think it's very telling that the first things that happen are institutional ones, right? The putting in place, not just of more permanent housing, but of things like schools and labor offices, of forms of administrative rule, right? And that one of the other notable things about UNRWA as a regime is its gradual, but very significant interpolation of Palestinian refugees as kind of the participants in the agency, right? So now, these are very rough numbers, but today UNRWA has something like 30,000 employees, and about 29,000 of them are Palestinian, right? And so one of the things that's happening is this kind of interpolation of refugees themselves into these kind of structures that maintain their confinement, right? And so I think that's something that doesn't happen immediately, but it does happen fairly quickly, right? We can see that by the end of the 1950s, even we have Palestinians running schools, running the administrative structures of the camps, negotiating. They're not at the top levels, of course, right? As is the case with so many kind of colonial and, neo-colonial institutions. But I think this is also in some ways strategic, right? That this will act as it is a kind of partitioned space, right? And it's a kind of, representative of the idea of the Palestinian nation state in exile that can be maintained partly because there is a degree of material and political buy-in from refugees themselves, right? And this is one of the real complications of UNRWA, of studying UNRWA as an institution, is that there is a real case to be made that by now it is a Palestinian agency, right? So I think that I think it is connected, and I think that there are a lot of strategies of making these structures permanent, right? That, at least in the case of UNRWA, this kind of narrative about its disappearance falls away fairly quickly, right? And the UNHCR too, and I think there's an institutional aspect to this as well, where these agencies have an interest in keeping their doors open, right? The UNHCR's intervention in Algeria was at least partially driven by the fact that it felt like the supply of European refugees was drying up and it was about to be shut down as an agency, right? So they're looking for mechanisms of maintaining their own institutional permanence, right? And I think that's something that mitigates directly against the interests of the refugees themselves, right? And has always been a kind of fundamental problem of the international refugee regime. And so we do right from the beginning have these contradictions where people are saying this is temporary, this is not going to be forever, you know, and yet we're putting into place institutions that look more and more and more and more permanent. And we have a kind of institutional commitment to the maintenance of these agencies as central significant aspects of a structurally permanent international authority.
They don't imagine.
They
don't imagine their own after. Like what?
No, they don't. And that's true even in these kind of individual cases, right? I mean, even in these kind of individual moments of, you know, intervention in particular places, they often don't imagine their own after, right? I think this is actually even more true today than it was in the 1950s, right? That it is vanishingly rare for an agency to go back to the UN, some sub-branch of the UNHCR to go back to the UN and say, we don't need any more money, right? We're done. So I think there are institutional imperatives there that are at work here as well. And the developmentalist thing is also very interesting because this is part of the kind of early Cold War strategy of, you know, creating American empire without territorial occupation. Right. And UNRWA is a very clear example of that. One of the things, I didn't really talk about this here, but one of the things that UNRWA does is to try to provide Palestinian refugee workers for various American commercial enterprises around the Middle East, including oil, you know, oil refining. So, you know, the connections are close, and we can really trace them out fairly easily. Yeah.
So we have two more questions in the room, and we have one online. So
okay.
We want to keep your responses short.
Okay.
So, well, thank you for this paper. I really enjoyed listening to you, and I'm not entirely sure if I'll be as articulate as you've been in asking my questions. So, we should be clear. But what really, what I found really persuasive about your argument was the way you talked about how there's a sort of rendering of a state of temporary into permanence, which then is almost a sort of a state in itself.
Yeah.
And in the context of partition, when I was thinking, it made me think about a removal of territory as a state aspiration, as refugee status is rendered. So if the state is relocated to the refugee camp,
right?
State, what's the relationship between state claims and aspirations and the territory where these claims and aspirations are imagined?
Yeah.
There's a sort of complete destabilization of that relationship between an imagined nation and then sort of reaching sovereignty at some point of time.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you're absolutely right? But I would say it's not just a removal of the territorial aspect of state, but also the removal of the rights aspects of states, right? And, you know, it does kind of beg the question of what a state replacement without any of those things is intended to accomplish, right? And I think I'm open to discussion on this point. I'm not sure, right? But I think that really confinement seems to be the kind of only goal, right? I mean, the only thing left. And I think from the perspective of refugees themselves, sometimes it offers a kind of, you know, maintenance and memory and hopes of a future, you know, change, right? That this is part of how they are invested in the system as well, to some degree, right? But you're right that it removes the territorial aspect of state. And it's interesting because I think there have been refugee activist efforts to kind of reimagine what states without territories might look like, right? And so, you know, we should acknowledge that there may well be kind of utopian as well as dystopian manifestations of that idea, and maybe ones that are potentially interesting, right? So yeah, bit of that.
Thanks, Laura. I think the tracing the genealogy of modern day refugee campaigns back to political war parties via Palestine is really interesting and quite persuasive. But you've given us a kind of imperial UN, and not the UN as the willing or unwilling tool of imperial powers, but sort of as an actor in its own right, kind of imperial UNHCR as well. I wonder if you're kind of projecting back the kind of tattered but mighty behemoth of UNHCR today into a period when actually it was a small legal office with a handful of staff and a tiny budget. So I wonder if you could say something a bit, and then giving it too much power, attributing too much causative power to decisions made by the UN, especially by UNHCR. So I wonder if you could consider a bit the role of states, UN member states, including new member states like Morocco and Tunisia in the 1950s, in driving this expansion of UNHCR. A bit about the role of humanitarian actors, which UNHCR wasn't, not until much later on in the 70s. Really. So it's working with implementing partners, like the League of Red Cross Societies, and about the role of refugees. Because it's definitely worth considering in the Palestinian case, for example. Palestinians had a clear idea of a long-term solution that did not involve any kind of resettlement or integration as the host. And it's come to be manifested clearly in the claim to the UNRWA registration card as a kind of national identity document. So if you could say about those things,
I'll try to be very quick. I mean, you're right. I do see, I guess I would say kind of in an upfront way that I do see both UNRWA and the UNHCR as essentially imperial institutions. And I would say that you're right, of course, that UNHCR is a very modest operation initially. Its reliance on these humanitarian organizations, however, suggests the continuities with its league and imperial predecessors, right? Because those are many of the same institutions that dealt with refugees in other contexts, or just kind of, humanitarian crises and other respects during the interwar period. The League of Red Cross Societies is one such example, but it's not the only one, right? We have lots of others. And so in a way, I think that in itself indicates the genealogy of this institution. Right. And the UN in general is driven by the interests of states, right? It is something that is in the name. It's not a surprise to any of us, right? It has no kind of independent internationalist iteration, really. But I think it does fairly quickly. This is one of its purposes, right? One of its purposes is to provide internationalist cover for these states' interests. And refugees quite quickly become a really important fulcrum of that effort, I think. And both UNRWA and the UNHCR are important beyond the numbers of their employees and the money that is coming into them because of the political and humanitarian legitimacy that they bestow on what are essentially state building operations, right? And that's equally true. That's equally true for post-colonial states, right? Tunisia and Morocco are driving UNHCR policy, in the Algerian War just as much as probably more than the French, right? And so I think that, we can acknowledge the ways in which the UNHCR is in fact fairly effective. I think this is maybe its great source of strength, right? That it can offer this kind of legitimization under humanitarian cover for processes that are essentially about building up particular kinds of state orders for the post-1945 world, ones that look very much like the pre-1945 world, in my view. So I think you're right, and that also, in terms of refugees themselves, this is a question I really struggle with respect to UNRWA, because, as I said, it is clearly a Palestinian agency in some respects. It is an agency in which Palestinian refugees have invested a great deal of political commitment, institutional work, right? These registration cards, as you say, are crucial. to the kind of claims to specific claims to Palestinian land, right? I mean, I think that's an important perspective as well. And also, its presence is clearly predicated on the premise that it will do its job of containing Palestinian claims and containing Palestinian bodies. And that is not an answer to your question. I don't know how to think about that, but I think that it does us a disservice not to recognize that aspect of what it's doing, right? And that's not a solution, and that's not really even an analysis, but I think that it's something that we are a little bit reluctant to talk about, and we need to not be, right? And this is one of the legacies of partition, that UNRWA has taken on that role of partitioning Palestinians kind of away from where they can present a challenge, and not just to Israel, but also to the surrounding states, which are all equally dependent on this kind of containment. So that's probably not a satisfactory answer, but I guess I would say that we do need to acknowledge the imperial purposes and the kind of imperial nature of the internationalisms with which we're dealing here, if we're going to have a real picture of both the past and the present.
Yeah, two things. It's so interesting. I find this, really convincing in terms of consequences of these institutions and what happens. But I wonder whether you can't still have your argument about the consequences without, but with the question of like, how does this happen, right? So, uppermost. And because I can think, well, then this is 67 protocol, right, which expands the definition of refugee, at which time the UN, state membership is, a much more diverse. In fact, one of the reasons why the US gets alienated is because, the General Assembly's things now dominated by the third world.
Yeah.
And I keep thinking about these institutions and how they work. And is it more, whether or not, one can notice, see what you see, which is really important. But think about like how, is there an explanation, if a clinical scientist came into the problem, or a sociologist, they might see an institution that's a bit more complicated, right? So that there might be what you regard as imperial consequences, but the journey there is more complicated because there are different kinds of actors with different kinds of ambitions or expectations. They don't know yet where they're going to end up, right? They don't know yet the long trajectory of the refugee that we described it. So, is it worth thinking about, the who's and how in the story, which adds the institution and the complex of spaces that opens up for different kinds of voices. I don't know. So if you find, I would be pushing that side of it actually, because I think the potential of your argument is so rich that it's worth thinking about how one arrives there, even though there might be actually different kinds of aspiration attached. And this is coming back to.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, there are many, voices and complications. I do think, so I think one of my goals here, and in some of the related projects that, attached to this topic, is that there is a degree to which we have accepted the discourse of the refugee regime as the reality of the refugee regime, right? And that one of the things I think we need to think about is the difference between what these institutions are saying they're doing and what they're actually doing. And the protocol is a good example, right? Because so in 1967, we have this protocol that removes the temporal restriction from the 1951 Refugee Convention. So now people who are just, who are subject to a fear of persecution after 1951 and anywhere in the world can be subject to the UNHCR regime. But that protocol is passed in an atmosphere where the UNHCR has already committed to only providing material aid, right? So one of its consequences is that it has completely abandoned any effort to adhere in a more general sense to the resettlement parts of the 51 Convention.
See, I think that this is really interesting because it comes back to how these institutions operate, even in the context of the league, right? So one of the consequences of what at the time, people might have thought, oh, if we do technical work, right,
right,
and that carries we don't get involved in anything, then we can survive. But otherwise, we're not going to survive. People aren't going to fund us anymore. I mean, it's not an excuse, but it's a kind of interesting way of thinking, understanding the rationales or the processes that bring certain realities into being. So they're not always covered. Like, so you've got a model which is like a humanitarian cover. So some people might have believed in humanitarian, you know, given choices.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure it matters what people think they're doing, right? I mean, I think that
Well, that gets like, I feel like I give up, right?
Yeah.
Like, what am I going to do?
I mean, I think that it's a bit like talking about missionaries in the 19th century, right?
Historians in the 21st.
Or historians in the 21st, yes. No, absolutely.
You know,
But I mean, I think I would like us to move away from kind of intentions and conversations about what people imagine they're doing and look at consequences, right? And that the consequences are actually very clear. And the consequence of the UNHCR's decisions in the 1950s and 60s, including the protocol moment, is to say, we are willing to give up on the principles of the 1951 Refugee Convention to keep our doors open, right? And that what we're doing is we're striking a bargain with all our member states, including post-colonial ones, which have every bit as strong an interest in doing things like maintaining borders as the superpowers do, right? You know, they're striking a bargain with those state actors to say, we will act as your agents of containment, right? And we will give it a smiley face. And this becomes, I mean, I think it's very difficult not to conclude that by the time you get to the 70s and the 80s, I mean, today, right? If you think about what is the UNHCR doing now, it's, you know, training, it's running deportation centers across the Middle East. It's training agents to, you know, send people back across the seas. Like it is not operating in the way that its discourse would suggest it does when we look at the details, right? When we look at specifics, when we think about particulars of how it tracks refugees, how it surveils them, how it controls their movement, how it empowers states to do all of those things, right? In the interests of maintaining, you know, there's a scholar, a political scientist, in fact, who has described the UNHCR as a global police of populations. And I don't think that's too much to say, right? I mean, I think that's correct. That is essentially correct. And so there's no doubt that we have individual actors within these institutions, and this has always been the case within, you know, the study of humanitarianism broadly demonstrates this, who go out to these places and believe that they are, you know, doing something altruistic, right? But the net result of those accumulated actions is one that supports a kind of global system of confinement for the vast majority of the world's displaced. And that, I think, is something that we've got to figure out how that happened, how to trace that back, and why we haven't seen it, right? Why are people convinced by these brochures that come in from places like the UNHCR that say we're providing food and water and shelter? It's because that is true, right? They are doing those things. And they are also doing lots and lots of other things that are actually much more central to their mission. So I know that sounds harsh, but I think it's, otherwise we don't understand what's happening, right? If we don't see this genealogy, if we don't look at what the outcomes of these practices are, rather than what the kind of haze of romantic language surrounding it says, we're not going to understand the circumstances in which these institutions are operating and the ideas from which they derive. So I think that's kind of what I'm trying to do here. And I think we could stand to have a clearer-eyed view of some of these internationalisms.
Thank you so much. We have one very specific question online, and I'll read it out to you, Laurence. You don't have
Okay.
to. Would you like to offer any reflections about the parallel that South Asian statesmen frequently drew with Palestine in the 1940s? Both India and Pakistan voted against Palestine's partition proposal at the UN in 47 for different reasons. Do you have any thoughts about why this was the case?
I mean, I think that they understood the realities on the ground in a way that was different from those who voted for partition, right? It's ironic, isn't it? I mean, it is actually both India and Pakistan were part of this minority report that, you know, that suggested some other quote unquote solution than partition for Palestine. So I guess, I mean, I think what I would say about that is that it suggests the possibility of alternatives, right? That there is nothing inevitable about the concept of partition or the way it played out in South Asia or the way it played out in Palestine, right? These are choices that people make. There were alternative suggestions. That minority report proposal has gotten vanishingly little attention in an otherwise extremely crowded field, right? So, you know, I think maybe it's a slightly hopeful note to end on, right? That in fact, there are other political imaginaries. We can find them, we can reconstruct them, we can reimagine them, right? These are not the only options. And I think that's one of the things that these histories of partition suggest is its total non-inevitability. And, you know, maybe even to be incredibly utopian, its reversibility at some point.
Fantastic. Thank you for a great.
Thank you.